All right, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but if I asked you, are you trustworthy? I wonder how many people say, sure, trustworthy. Do you keep your commitments? Are you a person of your word? No one's going to say, nah, not me, right? Everybody's like, no, of course I do that. When we moved to New Jersey from Canada, we bought a house. It had an unfinished basement. And one of the first things we did, because we knew we'd have family visiting from Canada a lot, was we wanted to finish a room in the basement. And so my dad came and helped me. We built a bedroom. It was a little bedroom corner that people could use when they showed up. And we did this, and then someone said, so did you get a permit? And I looked at him and I said, what? What do you mean permit? Oh yeah, you need permits. You have to get permits, and you have to get it inspected. I said, really? Because I had never heard of this. You didn't have to do this where I came from. And they're like, oh yeah, you need to do this. And I said, but you don't really have to. No one's going to know. And we were immediately faced with a decision. What do we do? Do we just not worry about it, as our friends, Christian friends, said? Or do we do what we should do? Let me ask it this way. Has anybody here told any lies or untruths in the past year? Again, don't put your hand up. Okay? Did you make any commitments that you did not live up to? You know what I'm talking about? Commitments to be somewhere, to be available for something, and then you weren't? Did you sign up for something and then back out? Have you misrepresented yourself to someone? Made yourself look a little bit better than you really were? So let me ask you, do you still think you're trustworthy? Or maybe the better question is, if I talk to your neighbors, your friends, your family, and your coworkers, what would they say? The people that know you best. See, we live in a culture with degrees of honesty and degrees of integrity. Now, if you're a little bit older, I don't know if this is still a thing, Jake, those of you that are younger, I don't know if this is still a thing, but if you're older, do you remember how you let people know that you were really telling the truth? Do you remember how that worked? Cross my heart, hope to, and if you're really serious, you said, stick a in my eye, right? I mean, and the implication was, of course, this is serious. I am really telling the truth. This, you can trust me. Unless, what? I had my fingers crossed behind my back, because then it didn't count. Do you remember doing this as a kid? Right? And this was all the things. And of course, people got used to looking for that, so then you would cross your fingers under the table, or you would cross your legs like this. Well, I had my feet crossed, right? Like this whole thing about what really matters. And we think, well, that's so foolish. And then we do it as adults. Because we tell someone something, they say, no, honest to God, this is true. You know what's in our legal system? You go to court, and they used to, at least, make you put your hand on your Bible and swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. The implication being that the Bible somehow would force you to be more truthful there than you would be elsewhere. And it's still true, because if you lie in a court, it's called perjury. It's worse to lie there than it is to lie somewhere else. You know, it's in our statements. Anybody ever had to make an affidavit? Have something notarized? What's the implication? Because what I've written, if I make this declaration that I've sworn to, well, that's worth more than if I had just written it down. Politicians have historically taken the oath of office by placing their hand on the Bible. Do you trust them? Most people consider themselves honest, reliable, trustworthy. And yet I did some research this week. Estimates say there are 180 million incidents of shoplifting every year in this country. Businesses lose 5% of their revenue to employee fraud and theft. A University of Massachusetts studies found that people in this survey lie almost 600 times per year on average. The University of Penn study estimated that $1.3 trillion of income is unreported, so people do not have to pay taxes. People routinely ignore laws, they ignore regulations, they're inconvenient for them. And this is not new. And so Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, he takes dead aim at this issue of selective commitment keeping. Selective integrity, because it was periodic and inconsistent, and I'm not sure much has changed today. But here's the thing. Keeping commitments sets you apart from the world around you. And how we treat them and how we treat that whole issue of integrity will mark us as different. So, as we go into this, Jesus was addressing, at its root, an integrity issue. Now, he mentions two problems that we're going to look at this morning. They're separate, but they're connected in this. And there's two little sections. Here's the first one. Kind of goes on the tail of last week, where he says, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce." Now, what Jesus is referring to is a much debated passage from Deuteronomy. So in the law, remember Jews had the law, it came out of the Old Testament. There's this passage of Scripture that was really, really debated among the scholars of the day. It came from Deuteronomy 24, and it says, "If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. And if, after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after he's been defiled." So he goes on. The key word and the thing that was of debate to all the scholars was that word indecent. What does that mean? And there are all kinds of schools of thought. Some of them there's some evidence that for some of the Jewish scriptural people, they said, look, when they said, if she does something indecent, it's talking about adultery. Right? That's it. But there were other schools of thought that seemed to have said that, man, this is kind of wide open, right? She burns the toast, you're out, right? I mean, there was this whole gamut, this whole range of things, and if the wife displeased her husband, he could divorce her. And in this culture, that meant the husband would give this writ of divorce, relinquish his legal claim on her as a wife, and it could only be done by husbands, not wives, although rabbis weren't stupid, and so they found ways for women to force this to happen if they wanted out. And so what you simply had to do was fulfill the requirements of the particular school of thought that you wanted to in order to move from one marriage commitment to the next one. Your marriage commitment was basically subject to some nebulous, changeable definition of what commitment looked like. And Jesus says that's an integrity issue. And then he follows it up right after that with the second one, where he says, again, you've heard it was said by people long ago, don't break your oath. Fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. Now, this is a little bit different. He's not talking about a specific verse, per se, but a collection, a set of ideas that still came out of the law. Like, here's some of them. If you go back into the law, it said, don't swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of the Lord. I'm the Lord. And then another place, it says, when a man makes a vow to the Lord and takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but he must do everything he said. Or another one, if you make a vow to the Lord your God, don't be slow to pay it. For the Lord your God will certainly demand it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. Whatever your lips utter, you must be sure to do, because you made your vow freely to the Lord your God with your own mouth. So, you have to understand a couple things for this to really land with us. Oath-taking was a huge deal in those societies, not just in Jewish society, but in societies as a whole. This idea of making oaths was a big deal. They were part of how you did business, it's part of how you did life. And so what had happened in Jewish culture was they had made this incredibly complex system of how you did oaths. And it was incredibly intricate in terms of what was valid, what was not. And so in Jesus' day, people abused these oaths all the time. All the time. When an oath was made and then it was broken, they had this elaborate system where the religious leaders would judge whether or not that was actually an oath or was it really not. How did you make the promise? Does it really count? Maybe it doesn't really fully apply because you didn't do it a certain way. There were whole sections of Jewish teaching that dealt with what vows were valid and which ones were not. Because, in that culture, oaths were used, they were part of culture, and they were celebrated, and Jesus says they are utterly unnecessary. Because this has more to do with your integrity than anything. So, here's kind of what Jesus is addressing, and I think we can identify. Keeping commitments was optional and situational. Commitments were easily made, commitments were easily broken. Your marriage commitment, your contract, your agreement, your being consistent in life, do you keep it? The answer was, it depends. Just make the right kind of commitment or the right kind of thing, and you could probably get out of it. And it happened all the time. Jesus says, look, that's not the way of the kingdom. And we think, yeah, well, we wouldn't do that. We don't make all these promises. How many athletes recently have you said, well, you just break your contract? Just move on. It's just the way of business. And we do the same thing. Well, I know I said I was going to do that, but when I said that, I didn't know I was actually going to get a promotion at work. Oh, I know I said I was going to go be a part of that, but you don't really need me to go, and there's some other stuff I really should do. You know, I committed to this, but I'm really not enjoying it anymore, and you kind of said this was going to be fun, so I don't really need to follow through on it. No, I know I made a vow to them for life, but they're not the same person that I made the vow to. But see, here's what made it worse. In Jesus' day, they were using God and religion. Instead of honoring their oaths before God, they were actually using religion and God to manipulate it and make it so they wouldn't have to keep their word. Jesus actually addresses this in a later place in Matthew, if you remember this. He's actually going after the Pharisees, the ones who made all these rules. He said, woe to you, blind guys. Because here's what they did. They said, you say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by their oath. In other words, you got to keep your word. You blind fools, what is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? Or, you also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. They would do religious gymnastics like this all the time. And Jesus says, that is not what this is about. And you can make all kinds of excuses all day long on what's come up or why you can't or what came in your place. He says, that's not the way of the kingdom. And we can use God the same way. I think God wants me to do something else, so I think I'm out. God is leading me to another church, so I'm cutting off all my commitments here and going somewhere else. I didn't really say I was going to do it. I said I was going to try and do it. You know, I'm needed over at this other ministry, so I can't do what I said I was going to do. Or how about this one? God wants me to be happy. So, the reason Jesus is going at this so directly is simply this. God's kingdom is opposed to the inherent selfishness of breaking commitments. Anytime we live without integrity, it's because we are being selfish. I mean, think about it. When you've broken a commitment, and we all have, or if we've all lied at different points in time, why do you do it? To avoid punishment, right? I don't want my parents to find out. Or just the consequences. If you're an adult, like, oh, if I say something, what's going to happen? I'm going to keep coming back to the story. When I found out we had to get permits for the basement, I thought, well, what if I call them now? Someone said, well, they can make you rip the whole thing out. I thought, well, I don't want to do that. Do I say anything? A lot of times we think we just want to get people on our side. If I represent it a certain way, we don't want to be blamed for something, or there's a better option. We like, oh, I didn't know that party was going on. That sounds way better. I'm going to make an excuse to get out of this because I want to go that way. Or we want to make ourselves look better. Even when we say, I'm doing it to protect someone else's feelings, we often use that as a smokescreen because we just don't want to have an uncomfortable conversation. That's why truth-telling, that's why integrity, this idea of commitments was so important, because at its heart, it's a selfishness that puts us before others, and the way of the kingdom is always to put others before ourselves. And so Jesus goes on and says, look, this is the problem, and I want you all to understand that keeping a commitment is the mark, is one of the marks of a Jesus follower. I was going to say something really goofy like this. A person of the word should be a person of their word. Did you catch that? But then I thought that's really stupid, so I didn't do it. Okay. But integrity, this idea of integrity and keeping your word, it's consistent with the character of God. What Jesus is saying, he's saying, look, if you are a follower of Jesus, if you're a member of the kingdom, this should be who you are. Do you remember what he called Satan? The father of lies. He's saying, look, when you live that way, and it's not just about, I said this and did this. It's much broader than that. He says, look, when you live a life with no integrity, where you don't keep your commitments and you don't follow through, you are living under the kingdom and the rule of Satan. And I need you to live under the kingdom and the rule of God. When we keep our commitments and we live as truth tellers, that's what we're doing. Again, remember, this all flows from a changed heart, right? We're going to say this over and over. Jesus has to change our hearts and remotivate us to something new. That's where it comes from. This isn't just about trying to follow rules, but he's saying, look, when that happens, this should be who you are. This is what should flow out of you. Now, that takes some work. And so Jesus goes on to say, well, you need to take responsibility then for your commitments. When you make them, stick with them. And so he follows up his statement about marriage by saying, I tell you. I mean, you guys have said that you just have to give a certificate of divorce. Here's what I'm telling you guys. Anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, I want to be sensitive here, because Jesus is saying, hey, look, all these things that you guys interpret about what's indecent, like feelings or emotions or burned toast or whatever it is, guys, that's not a reason to break your commitments. It's not good enough. That's not why we do it. A broken marriage is not part of God's design. Now, this message here is not primarily about divorce or marriage. In fact, Matthew doesn't spend any time on it here because there's a much bigger section later in his gospel where he talks about this. So I want to be sensitive to this. So understand when I say this that it's like I said last week, divorce is not the unpardonable sin, right? And a lot of you have had those things in your past. It doesn't mean you have to live with guilt and shame. It doesn't disqualify you from being a child of God or being used by him. But Jesus is saying, look, this was designed to be an exclusive, lifelong commitment. And that means a marriage must be an unrelenting commitment to an imperfect person, and that means that sometimes you have to be willing to be unhappy. That's not how they did it. Jesus says, you're missing the point. If you're a person of the kingdom, you have integrity, you keep to your commitments. Unless they got all hung up on the idea of it was just about marriage, he goes into that oath taking and says, well, now let me explain the rest of this for you. He says, I tell you, when it comes to just making promises now, one was a marriage promise, now I'm talking about promise as a whole, don't swear an oath at all. Either by heaven, and he has this really interesting thing he goes through here, we'll talk about it in a second. Either by heaven, for it's God's throne, by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And don't even swear by your head. You can't even make one hair white or black. All you need to do is simply yes. All you need to say is simply yes or no. And he says something interesting. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Now, just to be clear, God is not prohibiting, Jesus is not prohibiting oaths. God made oaths, right? As does Paul when he makes oaths. That's not really Jesus' point. He's saying, look, don't get hung up on that. You should not have to make an oath to keep your word. Shouldn't that be? Any statement from a kingdom citizen is a self-authenticating statement where they say it and you're like, yep, okay. They said it. They're a Jesus follower. They're good for it. Which means how I deal with commitments reflects something about me. Did you know that every time we keep or don't keep a commitment, it's saying something about you and your faith journey and how you view people? And so when he does he talks about, don't swear by heaven or by earth or by yourself. He's saying, he's kind of going through this saying, look, heaven is God's. You can't invoke his throne. That's him. That's his prerogative. You can't swear by the earth because he created it all. That's not yours. You can't use that to your own advantage. That belongs to God. You can't even use Jerusalem because what they would do, by the way, is if you swore by Jerusalem, that wasn't necessarily valid, but if you swore facing Jerusalem, now your oath was valid. That's the kind of things that he said, you can't even do that. Don't even do that because it's not yours to control. And in fact, don't even do it by yourself. So here's what Jesus is trying to tell him. He says, no matter what you're swearing by, it all belongs to God anyway. And all promises then are made before God. So just keep your word. Don't parse all these things. even including yourself, because you're not even in control of yourself. Every commitment we've ever made is to another person. You know that? Or it affects another person. No commitment you've ever made affects only you. Even if you make those resolutions to improve yourself, they still affect other people. Our commitments, they affect others. That's why this matters so much to Jesus. And so Jesus says, people and circumstances are not a reason to break or to not keep your commitments. Because if you've ever broken a commitment, no one has ever said, you know what? I don't want to. Not usually anyway. You know what? That's a terrible idea. You know, I said I wanted to do that and I committed to it, but I've thought about it some more. That doesn't sound fun at all. I'm out. People don't do that. What do? Oh, I had someone come visiting. I didn't know about that. Oh, you know, it's been one of those weeks. I'm just so tired and I really got to take care of myself. You know, we have all these reasons, all these excuses. You know, they did it. If they wouldn't have treated me that way, then I wouldn't have done this. You know, if they hadn't said that, I was going to keep my commitment. My boss didn't keep his side of the commitment, so I don't have to do mine. That's not fair. They shouldn't have. It's ridiculous for them to say, I need to get a permit for how I put the insulation in the walls of my new basement room. That's just silly. Why would I do that? And Jesus says, look, just let your yes be yes and your no, no. Period. Doesn't matter if they've earned your commitment. Do it anyway. The fact that you don't trust the government does not mean you are not obligated to pay your taxes. If a commitment that you made is going to cost you time, money, vacation, or even have an uncertain outcome, Jesus says, do it anyway. If a local zoning regulation makes you get an inspection that seems dumb and unnecessary, that's not the reason to ignore it. And so we thought, well, if we say we trust Jesus, then we'll do what we're supposed to do. And so we called, and the inspector came, and he said, yeah, this is not right. I could make you rip this out because you didn't do this the way you should have done it. Remember that? He said, we'll give you a workaround. It was not an easy workaround. And so we had to do that, and then before we finished the rest, we had to do more, and they came back, and then they would nitpick, and they'd say, that's wrong, and you had to do it again, and then they would come back, and they would... New Jersey, right? I just did my basement here, and the inspector came down, looked at it, and said, good job, here's your sticker. I'm like, wow, I like Delaware, right? They're way better than New Jersey, right? But the point was, we went over it, and it was a pain. It was one of those things, and when we were done, you know what our reward was? Our property taxes went up. We did it anyway. When we sold our house 2.5 years ago, the buyer came to us and they said, do you have all the permits for the work you've done? Because if you don't, you're going to have to go get them in order for this house to sell. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, we do. And I thought back and thought, if I had not lived with integrity 20 years earlier, the amount of hassle that would have caused us later. Just a simple little thing. And yet that's what God's doing here. He's saying, come on, you guys, if you're kingdom followers, your integrity, your word, your commitments, this is supposed to be who you are. It's not just about being truthful with facts, right? This is not just about, well, I said this and the fact was actually this. It's about keeping promises. It's about this idea of, I'm going to be a person who you can rely on. Oath-taking is actually a pathetic confession of our own tendency towards dishonesty. Scottish theologian A.M. Hunter said it this way: oaths arise because men are so often liars. The only reason you have to tell someone, cross my heart, hope to die, right? Stick a needle in my eye, is because too many times when you said something, it was a joke or we were misleading. Now, by the way, just a quick aside. Honesty does not mean you tell everybody everything that's on your mind all the time. Okay? I've met people like that, and they're like, I'm just being honest. I'm like, no, you're being a jerk, right? We are still supposed to live with love and grace and compassion and goodness and care. Right? So keep those things in mind. Right? But what Jesus is saying is, look, you guys got to be consistent. Keep your integrity in what you say. Because integrity is living the way God is calling you to live, even when nobody knows and nobody's watching. It means living up to your commitments when it costs you money, convenience, even reputation. Stand by it. In an era where truth is a rare commodity, we will stand out. In a time when we are encouraged to break contracts, act in our own interests, do whatever you need to do, the one who keeps their word is kind of like a unicorn. You can't find one. And what's interesting is in our culture, it's actually increasingly difficult for people to make a commitment and stick by it. Right? You know this. There's this thing that happens now when you set a meeting and people are required to go. You'll say, "Are you going to be there?" And they'll go, "I don't know. I'll let you know when I get closer in case something else comes up." What? Just put it on your calendar. Show up. And we've been every one of you has experienced this kind of things, right? People won't come to a specific meeting because something else came up that they like better. Or they just felt like staying home because they wanted to binge watch. I don't know. People call it a work all the time. "I'm sick." "Are you really sick?" "No, I just don't want to go to work today." People do this all the time. People work to sign up in a ministry at church. And 4 months later, you find out they haven't even been there for the last 3 times, didn't tell anybody, and now they're just not doing it anymore. And we can make all kinds of excuses for why we deceive or break commitments, but every one of them shows a lack of faith and a lack of trust. As Christians, we're supposed to be people that speak truth and live truth, people whose word can be relied on. And that applies when you fill out your tax return, when you fill out your timesheet, when you talk to your spouse about where you've been, when you tell your kids stuff about life. That's what we are called to do. Because we think, well, if I'm really honest on my tax return, I might actually have to pay more, and that's an issue of trusting God to provide. If I'm honest with that person, they're going to think badly about me. Again, not trusting that God's going to take care of the relationship. You know, if I'm honest about this sin, because I really need to be, people will reject me, which means I don't believe the gospel that I'm worthy in the midst of this. Keeping commitment sets you apart from the world, and that's what we should be like. So for the second time, I've never done this. For the second time in 4 weeks, I am quoting the theologian Dr. Seuss. Cousin Horton hatches the egg. Do you remember this story? He's doing his thing, and they keep telling him, you don't have to do it. It doesn't matter. And what does he say? "I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. An elephant is faithful 100%. What a great description of what it should be to be a Jesus follower. In 1929, in closing, let me tell you a quick story. In 1929, there was a 26-year-old government agent named Eliot Ness. You guys all familiar with this, right? Seen movies on this? He formed this elite 9-man team of incorruptible men, and their goal was to bring down Al Capone's $120 million criminal empire. This is in 1929, right? Billion-dollar empire today. At the time, Eliot Ness was making $2,800 a year. That was his salary. And one day early on, a young man walked into his office, and they handed Ness an envelope, and it had 2 $1,000 bills in it. And he said, "We will give this to you every week if you lay off." So Ness said, "No, thank you." Sent the messenger away with the money. And then he wanted to make a point. And he called a press conference, and newspapers and newsreels came from all these agencies, and he told the story of Capone's attempted bribe and what he had done to respond to it. And the next day, there's a movie on this, the headline said, "Ness and his men are" what? Untouchable. What could God do with followers of Jesus and churches that are untouched by a world that has no integrity? If we let God actually work through our commitments, we would end up living the way God designed it to be. Path to life as it was meant to be. And so, as always, we've done this every week, I'm going to take you back to the same 2 questions. When it comes to keeping your word, when it comes to your commitments, in what ways is your life, your attitudes, your actions lining up with this? Celebrate that. If you're a person who says, look, I can think of 10 stories where I kept my word and I didn't want to, and God came through, and it was like this. Or maybe you had the commitment and you're like, yeah, that was tough. God didn't really seem to do anything, but I kept it. I feel good about that. That was who I am. Celebrate those things. Thank God for them. But then ask the question, where is that not true in my life? Where have I gotten into this tendency of being lazy with my commitments, where I make them casually and I break them casually? Because for some of you, it's just you need to make less, right? Because you make too many. Some of you need to step up and actually make some, where you've just been kind of saying, I'm not going to make any commitments at all because then I'm not obligated to do anything. That's not a life of integrity. It's a life of laziness. So come on. Where is this not lining up? Where am I not living the way Jesus is inviting me to? Because I will tell you, there is peace in this that you can't find any other way. So I want to challenge you and invite you to celebrate this and to live into this week and beyond.